We've made it to our second week of the semester, but there's a sense in which this is our last week because tonight we're wrapping up a 6-week study that we began in the fall looking at Bart Ehrman's book, Did Jesus Exist? So we're going to do a little bit of review tonight, but then we're going to kind of set the stage for the next step in our study, okay? So those of you that are new, I see a couple of new faces, so just to kind of let you know where we're at in our overall argument this year. Our main theme is that we're making the case this year that Jesus is God. Every year in Rosh Hashanah we have a different theme, but we're focusing on reasons and evidence to believe that Jesus is God. And we think this is probably the strongest reason. So this is our main argument that we're focusing on, right? Premise 1, we have good reasons to believe that somebody is God if they can do signs, wonders, and miracles. Premise 2, which we're spending most of our time on, is that there's good historical evidence Jesus claimed to be God and did these miraculous things. Therefore, we would have good reason to believe that Jesus is God. The problem with miracles, one of the problems with this miracle test, as we call it sometimes, is that most miracle claims are either fakes or mistakes. So either people who are faking it, who didn't really do a miracle, but they're trying to trick you, or they've just made an honest mistake. And so how do we know if an actual miracle has taken place? Well, we've got to look at the evidence. It's like anything in life. Any claim that somebody makes, they need to back it up with evidence. So that's what we need to do with any miracle claims, including the claims of Jesus. Is there any tangible evidence? Are there any reliable eyewitnesses, for instance? And as we've seen, both sides admit that there is pretty good evidence for Jesus' miracles. We've brought this quote quite a bit from Antony Flew, one of the most well-known atheists in the 20th century, and he affirmed that the evidence for, in particular, Jesus' resurrection is pretty impressive, okay? So what we started a few weeks ago in the fall, in November, I believe, was starting to work through this book. And we're not going page by page, chapter by chapter. I read the book and I'm bringing kind of a summary for our purposes of what we're trying to do this year. But I encourage you to buy the book and read the whole thing cover to cover and then have it as a resource. I think it's a good resource for all of us to have. This is written by Bart Ehrman, who is an agnostic with leanings towards atheism. So you might wonder, as a Christian group, Rosh Hashanah, why in the world would we study a book like this? Well, I think it's strategic, first of all, in the sense that, sure, we could use Christian writers, Christian scholars, to present this basic evidence for the historical Jesus, but it comes across a bit stronger when we use a non-Christian in this instance. So a lot of times, non-Christians I've found are more willing to listen and consider the evidence if it's coming from, in this case, someone like Bart Ehrman. So he wrote this book in response to a group of people who he has labeled mythicists. And these are folks who don't believe that there even was a historical person named Jesus in the first century. And so he wrote this 300, 400-page book laying out just all the historical evidence for this Jesus of Nazareth. Now, one of the things that Bart explained in this book is that historians, when they do their investigation of history, right, they're never able to achieve absolute certainty, right? There's a sense in which we can't be absolutely certain that such and such happened in history, right? We can never achieve that very high epistemological level, if you will, of achieving absolute certainty in our knowledge of the past. And this is very difficult for a lot of folks to understand. We've talked about this a few times already this year, but I want to just spend a couple more minutes discussing this. And I think one of the reasons, this is a new term to me, I just heard somebody else use it in a different context, had nothing to do with apologetics or even religion for that matter. But I think one of the reasons why it's difficult for people to understand that we can't achieve absolute certainty, it's called, this new term, new to me at least, is the CSI effect. It's partially due to this CSI effect. Because at least in our culture, in the American culture, we've kind of been trained by our TV shows, right? We watch crime shows, mystery shows, and the writers, they got to wrap it up in 45 minutes, right? And so usually by the end of the episode, there's some sort of evidence that is discovered, whether it's DNA evidence or some other smoking gun, that proves or solves the mystery with absolute certainty, right? Because we all like nice, everything tied up at the end of our TV shows. We don't want anything hanging out there. And so we're used to seeing some sort of evidence that just solves the mystery conclusively. But as Bart Ehrman, I think, rightly pointed out, life just doesn't work that way. And especially in the field of historical investigation, we're not going to achieve that level of certainty. We don't want our thinking trained by TV shows. So here's one of the quotes from Ehrman's book, where he wrote, "This is all the historian can do, establish what probably happened in the past. To demand a criterion that yields certainty is to step outside of historical research. All we can establish are probabilities." Now, I prefer not to use that term when talking about the past. I used to be a statistician. I worked in the field of actuarial science, a lot of statistics, probability theory, so on and so forth. And I'm more comfortable using the term probability to talk about the future, okay? About what might or might not happen, let's say tomorrow or next year. It feels very odd to me to use the term probabilities when talking about the past, because it seems to me that something either happened in the past or it didn't. There's no probably about it. Either it happened or it didn't. What we're discussing more in this context is our knowledge of what happened in the past, okay? And so I think in this sort of discussion, when we're talking about our knowledge of the past, it's more appropriate to use the term certainty or degrees of certainty. Okay, so simple example, we could say, it's probably going to snow tomorrow, but it might not. Okay, that's how I'm more comfortable using that term probably or probabilities. I wouldn't say it probably snowed yesterday or it probably snowed on this date last year. I would say more something to the effect is I'm pretty certain it snowed yesterday, if I remember right, or this date last year, I'm pretty certain that it snowed. I just wouldn't use the term probability to talk about an event in the past like that, because either it snowed last year on February 1st or it didn't. And Ehrman uses this term as well in certain places. So as you can see, he uses certainty, and I think that's a better phrase to use. So I'm going to give you guys a discussion question at this point. I want you to discuss at your tables, get together, and talk for a few minutes about this idea of absolute certainty. Do you agree with Bart Ehrman and myself? Him and I would be on the same page, but maybe you disagree with us. Do you think we can achieve absolute certainty in our knowledge, in particular maybe our historical knowledge? Why or why not? And does this ever bother you? Does this frustrate you? Do you struggle with this idea of not being able to achieve absolute certainty? And then where do we go from here? Because then there's also a cliff on the other side. Folks who give up absolute certainty unfortunately fall too far to the other side and think that, well, then we can't know anything. So I'll let you guys discuss that for a few minutes at your table. Go ahead. Okay, well, another helpful thing that Ehrman lays out in the book is he talks a lot about what makes historians more certain that a particular event has actually happened in the past. So he laid out various criteria, right, and explained all of them, and we walked through them earlier last year in November. And the more of the criteria that a particular event meets, for instance, the more certain we can be that that particular event happened in history. So you might remember these criteria, right? Ehrman explained them really well, and we walked through them all. So if you have, for instance, multiple sources, right? Multiple sources saying that this event happened that are independent, right? It's not as though Mike told Sarah about the car accident, so then you have two people. No, that's not independent, because Sarah's knowledge of the car accident would be from Mike. But if they saw it independently, then they're independent witnesses, independent sources, if you will. Corroborating, right? If they both say the same thing about the incident, right? That would be corroborating. That would be an important criteria to meet. That gives us more certainty. None of this gets us to 100%, but the more of these criteria are met, the more certain we can be. Okay? Early sources are helpful. Obviously, just because something is early doesn't necessarily mean that it's true, but compared to something much later, to have an early source is better. Extensive sources, he talked about how when you have a source that spends a lot of time talking about the event, gives you much more information, the better. That raises our level of certainty. And then non-biased sources, and that's probably the one that we spent the most time on. This, what was the dissimilarity? And we talked through how to use, because that's the most controversial criteria, because a little bit of subjectivity squeaks into there. So a large portion of Ehrman's book then was how he walked through several sources that meet these criteria. In fact, he laid out over 20 sources, depending on how you combine things, add them up, at least 20, possibly more, depending on how you count them up. Independent sources about the historical Jesus. And we spent several weeks walking through all these sources and saw what Ehrman had to say about them. Okay? So a lot of sources about the historical Jesus that pass these criteria. What I'm going to do now is give you a few quotes from Ehrman as he kind of sums up all of these sources. We've looked at all of them individually, but Ehrman here, in just a few quotes I'm going to share with you, sums up everything that we've, I guess, gleaned from these sources. And he'll affirm how they meet these criteria that he laid out. Historians look at. Okay, so a few quotes from Ehrman here, summing this up. He wrote, "He, Jesus, is attested clearly by Paul, independently of the Gospels, and in many other sources as well, in the speeches of Acts, which contain material that predate even Paul's letters, and later in Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, Revelation, Papias, Ignatius, 1st Clement. These, just here, are 10 witnesses that can be added to our 7 independent Gospels, either entirely or partially independent, giving us a great variety of sources that broadly corroborate, you see many of the criteria that he's going through, they corroborate many of the reports about Jesus without evidence of collaboration. And this isn't counting all of the oral traditions that were in circulation even before these surviving written accounts. Moreover, the information about Jesus known to Paul appears to go back to the early 30s, as arguably does some of the material in the book of Acts. So very early material. The information about Jesus in these sources corroborates as well aspects of the gospel traditions, some of which can also be dated back to the 30s, to Aramaic-speaking Palestine. Together, all of these sources combine to make a powerful argument that Jesus was not simply invented, but that he existed as a historical person in Palestine. A couple more quotes as he summarizes all of these sources. Later he wrote, "We're not then dealing merely with gospels that were produced 50 or 60 years after Jesus' alleged death as the principal witnesses to his existence. We're talking about a large number of sources dispersed over a remarkably broad geographical expanse, many of them dating to the years immediately after Jesus' alleged life, some of them from Palestine itself. On the basis of this evidence alone, it's hard to understand how Jesus could have been invented. Invented by whom? Where? When? How then could there be so many independent strands of evidence?" 2 more short quotes from Ehrman summing this up. "These oral traditions about Jesus did not arise 20, 30, or 40 years after the traditional date of his death. On the contrary, As we've seen, they began in Aramaic-speaking Palestine, and we can give reasonably hard dates. At the very latest, they started in the early 30s, a year or two after Jesus allegedly died. They almost certainly started even earlier than that. All right, last one. Quote from Ehrman summing up all these sources that meet these criteria. Since no one would have made up the idea of a crucified Messiah, this is more of that dissimilarity criteria, Jesus must have really existed, must really have raised messianic expectations, and must really have been crucified. No Jew would have invented him. And it is important to remember that Jews were saying that Jesus was the crucified Messiah in the early 30s. We can date their claims to at least 32, when Paul began persecuting these Jews. In fact, their claims must have originated even earlier. Paul knew Jesus' right-hand man, Peter, and Jesus' own brother, James. They are evidence that this belief in the crucified Messiah goes all the way back to a short time after Jesus' death. So as we've seen over the last few weeks, there's a whole lot of information that we have about the historical Jesus that meets all of these criteria. Now, not everything in the New Testament meets these criteria. For example, we talked about Jesus having sisters. There's only one of these sources that says that Jesus had sisters. So that doesn't pass the criteria of multiple independent sources. Does that mean he didn't have sisters because we only have one source that said it? Well, no, we can't make that conclusion. But we just can't be as certain about Jesus having sisters because we only have one source that said it. Whereas we have multiple sources, multiple independent sources that said he had brothers. So we can be historically much more certain that he had brothers. And then we can just list everything, for instance, in the New Testament and kind of make a list. What is multiply attested, what goes back really early, what might come a little bit later, and we can kind of rank. And this is what historians do and how they develop more certainty about some parts in the New Testament than others. For example, whether he had brothers or sisters. All right, well, based on these sources then, what basic facts do all scholars agree on about the historical Jesus? This is something that Ehrman brings up quite a bit throughout his book. What are the things that all scholars, Christian, non-Christian scholars, agree on about the historical Jesus? In other words, what are some basic things about this historical Jesus that pass all of these criteria with flying colors? And this is the list that he has presented, okay? So Ehrman, page 269, 270, he lays out this list. All scholars, Christian, non-Christian scholars, affirm that Jesus was a man from Nazareth. He lived as an adult in the AD 20s. He followed and then was baptized by John the Baptist. Then he became a teacher in rural Galilee, preached about the kingdom of God through parables. He developed a reputation for being able to heal the sick and cast out demons. Around AD 30, he went to Jerusalem for a Passover feast and roused opposition among Jewish leaders, which arranged to have him put on trial before Pontius Pilate. And then Pilate ordered him crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. Okay, I want to have you guys do another discussion question at this point, and I want you to talk about this approach where Ehrman says often, all scholars affirm X, Y, Z. All scholars agree on these certain things. How useful or compelling is that to note all scholars believe or all scholars agree? Do you find that to be very compelling when people use that term or that phrase? Do you find it compelling that all these scholars affirm these things? What can and can't we conclude about a certain fact when all scholars affirm it? What are some things that we can conclude from the fact that all scholars affirm it? And what things can't we conclude from that? And then lastly, how would you respond maybe to to a skeptic who might say that, look, Ehrman claims that all scholars affirm these things, but Ehrman really needs to produce a list of all these scholars and give documentation that they really do affirm these things. How would you respond maybe if somebody pushed back on Ehrman in that regard? How would you, if you were Ehrman, maybe push back on that or respond to that objection? Okay, go ahead and discuss at your table for a few minutes here. I find it pretty compelling, right, to know or to have a New Testament scholar, a New Testament historian like Bart Ehrman, who's very well known and respected in the field, right? When he says all New Testament scholars affirm these certain facts, that's very compelling to me when I hear an expert say that, or when all scholars affirm certain things. Now, what we can't conclude from that is that they're necessarily correct, right? I think I heard many of you guys say that at your tables. Just because all scholars agree on something, that doesn't mean that they're right. Because there's been situations where there's been a vast majority, right, in a particular field who believe something, and it turned out that they were wrong. So again, as we talked about, we're not going to achieve absolute certainty here, but I think it goes a long way to find out that all scholars who work in this field as a profession agree on certain things. I find that to be very compelling. However, we don't want to stop there, though. We want to look at the evidence which has caused them to be so certain, right? So we just don't want to say or just conclude, well, if all scholars believe it, it must be true. No, we want to investigate the evidence which has led them to that conclusion, right? And that's what we try to do as best as we can. We're not professionals, right? We don't have 50 hours a week that we can pour into this, as some people do. Maybe some of you are called to this field and we'll get that chance. But as best we can with the time and resources we have, I think we should look into the evidence and see why scholars have become so confident that these things have happened. Yeah, this idea that Ehrman needs to back this up with the list of scholars, I just don't think that that's necessary, right? This is how most experts in their field talk, right? Whether it's like dentistry, I think it's safe to say something like, virtually all dentists would encourage you to brush your teeth. I'm sure there's a few outliers out there who have something against brushing your teeth. They would have some other avenue of cleaning your teeth instead of brushing. But I think the vast majority of dentists would say, all dentists, all professionals in this field say you should brush your teeth. And that's just how experts talk. I don't fault him for that. It's how we talk about evolution often, right? So we know very well that virtually all professional biologists who work in the field of biology affirm evolution. That doesn't mean it's true, but I think that should get our attention if all biologists who work in the field. Now there's some outliers, obviously, who don't believe in evolution. But again, we need to look at the evidence that has led them to that conclusion. But when somebody says, all biologists affirm evolution, I don't fault them for that. I think that's probably true, and I don't ask them to provide a list of everybody who believes in evolution within biology. I recognize that virtually all biologists affirm it. Okay, as we've discussed, I thought we would mostly use Ehrman's material just to cover what I've called this foundational information about Jesus. So what I mean by the foundational stuff is just the things that all scholars affirm, both Christian and non-Christian scholars affirm. So here's a longer list, right? This is just a summary. This is just a few examples of this foundational material. And then I thought that we would move on from Ehrman's material to have to use Christian scholars or material from Christian scholars to make a case for these other things, what I have called level 2 or level 3, what only Christian scholars affirm, that Jesus performed miracles, rose from the dead, is fully God, so on and so forth. I thought we would have to use materials exclusively from Christian scholarship to do that. At least that's what I thought at the beginning of this study. But lo and behold, what we've discovered is that no, in fact, we can use Ehrman's material not only to make a case for some of this foundational stuff. I think that there are things within Ehrman's book that we can use to make a case for level 2 and level 3. And you've probably noticed that as we've gone through Ehrman's material. And if you've forgotten, I'm here to remind you. Okay, we all discovered as we went through Ehrman's book that he affirms that Jesus' miracles pass a lot of these criteria. Remember the 6 criteria? Early, independent sources, right, that corroborate but don't have evidence of collaboration, right? So the sources we have that talk about Jesus' miracles pass a lot of those criteria. So let's go back and look at some of those things that Ehrman wrote about Jesus' miracles and how they pass a lot of these criteria. Take a look at this when we talked about the speeches in the book of Acts. Ehrman wrote, even more significant for our purposes are the speeches recorded in the book of Acts. About a fourth of Acts is made up of speeches delivered by Peter in the first third and Paul in the final 2/3. Some of the speeches in Acts contain what scholars call pre-literary traditions, oral traditions, that had been in circulation from much earlier times that are found now only in their written forms in Acts. This is important information because here again it shows that Acts is not simply a document from the 80s. It incorporates much older traditions. And these older traditions are quite emphatic that Jesus was a Jewish man who lived and did spectacular deeds, taught, was executed as a human in Jerusalem. Talking about these spectacular deeds, these are the miracles. He goes on more to discuss them here. The speeches of Acts contain very ancient material, much earlier than the Gospels. It's significant as well because these speeches are completely unambiguous that Jesus was a mortal who lived on earth and was crucified under Pilate at Jewish insistence. Consider the following extracts from 3 of these significant speeches. And then Ehrman quotes these 3 speeches, which we'll quickly take a look at here. And notice in these early speeches, early material, they go back, he dates to the 30s, how it talks about Jesus' miracles. So, an excerpt from Acts 2. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God through miracles and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, just as you know. This one who was handed over through the hand of the lawless by the appointed will and foreknowledge of God, and you nailed him up and killed him, but God raised him by loosing the birth pangs of death. So in the earliest sources we have, it says that he did miracles and rose from the dead. Here's 2 more early things, early speeches from the book of Acts. God glorified his child Jesus, whom you handed over and denied before Pilate, who had decided to release him. But you denied the holy and righteous one and demanded a murderer to be given over to you. But you killed the author of life, who then God raised from the dead, as we are witnesses. And then lastly here from Acts 13, one of these ancient speeches from much earlier than when Acts was written, said, for those who live in Jerusalem and their leaders, when they found no charge worthy of death, they asked Pilate to execute him. And when they had fulfilled all the things that were written about him, they took him down from the tree and placed him in a tomb. But God, again, here we see the resurrection, raised him from the dead. So not only are they independent, they're extremely early accounts that talk about Jesus as a miracle worker. And Ehrman affirms this, right? You might remember we read this quote from Ehrman last semester. Ehrman wrote, the idea that Christians were telling stories of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection before Luke, before Mark, and before Paul is held by virtually all scholars of the New Testament, and for compelling reasons. We've looked already at the speeches in the book of Acts. These speeches show clear signs of having derived from the earliest Christian communities. These speeches must come from exceedingly early times, and in them we find summaries of Jesus' life and death. where it's clear he was a Jewish teacher and miracle worker who was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of the Jews. This story is not invented by Mark. It was in circulation from the earliest period of Christian storytelling. Now, the other very impressive early source that we have is from Paul's letters. And it wasn't so much as Paul's letters, which are impressive in their own right, but it was the ancient creeds that Paul quoted in his letters that go back to a very earlier time than when he wrote his letters. So here is Ehrman talking about these creeds we find in Paul's letters. Ehrman wrote, "There are solid reasons for thinking that Paul understood Jesus to have died recently. I can start with that basic confession of faith that Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians 15, a confession that was passed along to him by those who came before him, as he himself states. For I delivered over to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Now, I'm going through all of this again to point out that even Ehrman agrees that these accounts of Jesus' miracles and his resurrection meet a lot of the historians' criteria, which raises our degree of certainty that these events actually happened. In the very next paragraph here, Ehrman talks about this ancient creed that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15. Ehrman wrote, "Several points are worth emphasizing here about this creed. This ancient creed is neatly balanced, poetical statement with two halves. In both halves, it makes a claim about Christ, that he died and that he was raised, indicates that the claim is in accordance with the Scriptures, and then offers empirical proof. That he died is proved by the fact he was buried, and that he was raised is proved by the fact that he appeared to Cephas, Peter, and then to the 12. Now, let me remind you that according to Ehrman, these creeds date back to the early 30s. And we kind of walked through this history. I'm not going to read this whole long paragraph. But basically, Ehrman is saying, look, when us historians, New Testament scholars, crunch the numbers, it looks like these creeds were probably developed at least as early as the mid-30s and possibly go back even further. And we have some of that autobiographical detail from Paul himself, where he said he visited Cephas and James and most likely got a lot of this information. So it's this sort of historical evidence that leads atheist scholars like Ehrman and another one here, Gerd Ludemann, to affirm that the resurrection was being proclaimed very early. This wasn't a legend that developed decades later. This was Jesus' resurrection was being talked about, proclaimed, just within a couple years of the cross. That doesn't prove that it's true, obviously, but it meets one of those criteria. Early independent sources. Okay? Now, since we can use Ehrman's material to show how Jesus' miracles and resurrection meet a lot of these criteria, you might be wondering then why Ehrman himself rejects our argument that Jesus is God based on his miracles. Why do you think it is then that if miracles, even according to Ehrman, pass a lot of these criteria, why does Ehrman reject them and ultimately reject our argument that Jesus is God? You know, our argument's based on his miracles, of course. So why do you think Ehrman rejects that? I'll let you guys discuss at your table here for a few minutes. Okay, this might be a helpful explanation as to what's going on here. So, as I talked about, imagine if somebody listed out all the propositions that are made in the New Testament, right? It probably a list of hundreds of propositions, right, about the historical Jesus. That he had brothers, that he had sisters, that he was crucified under Pilate, that he taught in parables. I mean, just think, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of propositions in the New Testament, right? And so what's going on here is there are some of these propositions that pass these historians' criteria with flying colors. Like just take as instance, the top 10 would be the ones that Ehrman laid out, that all scholars affirm, right? So if you remember that top 10 list that all scholars affirm, those are propositions in the New Testament that pass all of the criteria with flying color, right? There's a lot of propositions in the New Testament that don't pass all the criteria, right? We've used the example, the proposition that Jesus had sisters, right? That doesn't pass the criteria with flying colors because only one source said that. So if you would rank all the propositions about the historical Jesus in the New Testament from the ones that pass the criteria the best, passed most of the criteria, all the way to rank it to the bottom, the propositions that passed the least amount or none of their criteria, right? That he had sisters would be towards the bottom. That he was crucified under Pontius Pilate would be towards the top. And then this ranking would also provide that certainty, right? So those things at the top that pass more of the criteria, historians are more certain actually happened. And then things at the bottom of the list, historians wouldn't deny necessarily, but they would have less certainty that those propositions were true. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not saying that just because there are some true things in the New Testament, that doesn't mean that historians are going to accept everything in the New Testament. They rank it. They rank the propositions or verses, if you want to say it that way, in the New Testament based on how many have multiple sources, independent, all the criteria, right? And then they rank them on certainty. What I'm saying is, according to Ehrman, it looks as though miracles, the fact that Jesus did miracles and rose from the dead, would be pretty high on that list. Because it seems to pass a lot of those criteria. And even Ehrman is making that case. Even Ehrman is saying that, yes, the accounts of his miracles and resurrection is early. It's in multiple independent sources. And so it seems that would be higher on the list, definitely higher than the fact that he had sisters, because we only have one early source that says that. Does that make more sense of what I'm getting at here? So the question then is, so why, if it is the case that Jesus' miracles and resurrection does pass many of these criteria, why would he ultimately reject them? That's what I'm trying to get at here. Now, what's interesting to me, there's another book, and this was a debate book that he did with a Christian New Testament scholar who kind of went from his journey is almost the opposite. He's an Australian New Testament scholar. His last name is Bird. I'm forgetting his first name right now. But he had a debate with Ehrman. And Bird was an atheist for most of his life. And then because of, it was so compelled by the evidence for Jesus' miracles, resurrection, became a Christian. And he's a well-known New Testament scholar. They had a debate on these issues. And I want to show you some quotes from that debate. And it's a debate book called "When Did Jesus Become God?" ? And in these quotes, it almost seems that Ehrman affirms Jesus' miracles, what we would call Jesus' miracles. So take a look at these quotes. In this debate book, Ehrman wrote, "What convinced people that Jesus was resurrected is that Jesus appeared to people. It's the appearance of Jesus alive again after his death that convinced people he had been raised from the dead. Several people almost certainly claim to see Jesus alive afterward, because again, it meets the historian's criteria. Historically, I think these people really did claim that they saw Jesus alive afterward. Peter figures prominently in these narratives as one who saw Jesus. According to Paul, Peter was the first to see Jesus after his death. Paul himself says he had a vision of Jesus. He is unambiguous about it. In the Gospels, Mary's the one who goes to the tomb and learns he's been raised from the dead and then sees him." Another quote later in the book, in his debate with Bird, he said, and then it was transcribed in the debate book, "I think there's a very clear explanation for these, Paul's and Peter's transformations. Their lives radically changed. Both men believed that after his death, Jesus appeared to them. They believed on the basis of something they saw and or heard. that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and that completely turned their lives around. So if Ehrman, hypothetically, let's say if Ehrman does believe that Jesus did these things, why would he reject the argument then that Jesus is God? Well, one of the primary reasons he rejects our argument is because he doesn't believe that there is a God. This is another quote from that debate book from Ehrman. He said in that debate, "Eventually, the reason I left Christianity altogether was unrelated to my scholarship. It's because I simply no longer could believe that there was a God who was active in a world where there just is so much pain, misery, and suffering, where a child, an innocent child, starves to death every 5 seconds. I realized that I just don't believe it anymore, so I became an agnostic about 20 years ago." Now, I sympathize, with this, the problem of evil, and we've talked a lot about the problem of evil here at Ratio Christi. But notice, if he doesn't believe in God, he thinks that miracles are impossible then. That is, if you define a miracle as a supernatural act of God. So this shows the importance of what we harp on a lot at Ratio Christi, and that is the importance of making a case for the existence of God before you start making a case for Jesus' miracles. Because if somebody doesn't believe that there is a God, they wouldn't even be able to process the idea that somebody is God or did miracles by God's power, because they don't think that there is a God to begin with. As we've talked about, and as Lewis said so well, making a case for the existence of God is the best way to argue for the possibility of miracles. Doesn't mean that all miracle claims are true, but if there actually is a God, we have to be open to miracles actually taking place. Lastly, one more quote here from Ehrman about this issue of miracles is why he rejects miracles ultimately, and then would reject our argument that Jesus is God based on his miracles, is that he doesn't think that historians can evaluate miraculous events. And this has taken me a little bit of time to process exactly what he means by that statement, but I think I get it now. And I think this paragraph will help explain why he thinks that historians can't even really touch him. Can't even really, when I say, hold them up to these criteria, he would just dismiss that completely. He would say historians can't even put miracles on the list. Whether he had brothers, sisters crucified under Pilate, whether he did miracles or not, isn't even something that historians can evaluate. So here's how he explains what he means by that. He wrote, "On page after page of the Gospels, we're confronted with reports of the miraculous. As Jesus defies nature, heals the sick, casts out demons, raises the dead. Oh, what's the historian to make of all these miracles? The short answer is that the historian can't do anything with them. They can't even go on the list. We can't even evaluate them in light of the criteria. Suffice it to say that if historians want to know what Jesus probably did, the miracles will not make the list, since by their very nature and definition, they're the most improbable of all occurrences. Some would say, of course, that they're literally impossible. Otherwise, we would not think of them as miracles. I don't need to enter into that question here, but can simply say that even though the majority of Jesus' activities in the Gospels involve the miraculous, these stories don't provide much grist for the historian's mill. But in an indirect way, they do provide some limited grist. Even though historians, when speaking as historians, as opposed to, for example, to historians speaking as believers, cannot say that Jesus really did, for example, heal the sick and cast out demons, they can say that he had the reputation of having done so. And there's nothing improbable about someone having a reputation as a miracle worker. So I want to give you guys one last discussion question here tonight and talk through this issue. What do you make of this? This idea that, historians can't even really evaluate miracles, can't even put them on the list to meet the criteria or not. What do you think about that? Agree, disagree, and why? So go ahead and discuss for a few minutes at your table. All right, sorry I got to cut the discussion a little bit short. I didn't give you much time to discuss that go round. I didn't notice on my watch here how close we were getting to 8:30. So we've really tried to end things at 8:30 for you guys because we know a lot of you have homework to do and girlfriends, boyfriends to talk to, and so on and so forth. So we'll wrap things up here by 8:30. Might have to give me an extra minute or two, and then we can discuss further in small groups. But yeah, I disagree. Obviously, I think historians can evaluate miracles, right? Especially, let's say, if they're a historian who believes that there is a God, based on good reasons and evidence to believe that there is a God. I think that then they can evaluate whether a miracle has taken place or not, right? So if let's say I've become convinced that there is a God based on good reasons and evidence, and then there's various miracle claims, well, I certainly should be able to, I would hope that I should be able to try to ascertain whether a certain miracle claim is true or false, right? I hope that I would be able to have some way to know if some guy ran up to me on the street claiming to do miracles and did some fancy stuff in front of me. I would hope that I have some way of being able to ascertain whether he is really doing miracles or not. So I think if there is a God and miracles are possible, I think the historian can evaluate whether miracles happened or not. In fact, it seems to me what's going on here is, if historians are open to the possibility of miracles, then they would pass Jesus' miracles, and especially his resurrection, past the criteria with flying colors, even to the point of which, if it wasn't a miraculous thing, if it was just something like he had brothers or he had sisters, I don't think it would even be controversial at all. I think people would just flat out say, of course he rose from the dead. We have so much independent eyewitness sources for this that don't have any evidence of being corrupted or collaborating. In fact, they seem to corroborate. So if it wasn't miraculous, I don't think people would even question it because it passes the criteria, the historian's criteria, so well. I don't agree that they're the most improbable of all occurrences. Or no, I should say it this way. It seems like he's almost putting out Hume's argument against believing in miracles here. So when he talks about historians can't believe them because they're the most improbable things, that sounds, if you're familiar with, and we talk about this a lot in Rosh Christi, Hume's argument against believing in miracles. And I just think that's a poor argument because it takes you, it puts you in a position where you shouldn't believe in something that could happen, but you should never believe that it happened because it's improbable. And if you follow that consistently, you're not going to believe in any improbable events. You're not going to believe, any cases of getting, let's say, a hole-in-one or a perfect poker hand or anything that's improbable if you follow that consistently. So no, I think if you believe that there is a God, so miracles are possible, I think they can be evaluated historically based on the evidence. And a lot of scholars do. A lot of Christian scholars, as we'll see, affirm Jesus' miracles based on them passing these criteria, even the criteria as Ehrman has laid them out. Now, Lycona, as you'll see, Michael Lycona, who we're bringing in, a New Testament scholar to talk about evidence for Jesus' miracles, he'll say something similar, that historians can't really evaluate miracles, but he means something radically different than this. What Lycona means when he says that historians can evaluate miracles is that historians can't investigate the cause of the miracles, the cause of the event. So for instance, just to keep it simple, Lycona will say things to the effect of, look, historians can evaluate whether Jesus rose from the dead or not, but historians can't evaluate the cause of his rising from the dead. That seems to be something that's beyond the historian's ability to figure out. However, as Lycona will explain, the context helps tremendously, okay? So for instance, use the example of you see a blind person receive their sight at Runza tomorrow, right? And if they're just sitting there eating their Runza and they're blind and all of a sudden they can see, There's no contextual events around that. They just start seeing. It'd be very difficult to know what the cause of that is, right? Maybe some alien source, maybe God. If you believe that there is a God, right, it'd be difficult to nail that down. However, if, let's say, somebody runs in the restaurant and says, I'm going to pray to God that you receive your sight, and then they pray, and then the person receives their sight, well, I think, and this is how Lycona explains it, that would give you not absolute certainty, but it would give you more reason to believe that it was God that caused that event to happen. And so when you have Jesus, for instance, then all this contextual situations where he's claiming to be God, he's pointing to his miracles as evidence for being God, right? You have all those contextual things, explaining that he was going to rise from the dead, and then does those things. I think that provides the context, which can lead us to believe that his claims really are true, that he really is God. So the last thing I want to say is that obviously Ehrman doesn't believe that these miracles happened, okay? But he does affirm that the early followers believed them, okay? So at a minimum, I think Ehrman is helpful in the sense that we can show these claims about Jesus' miracles and his resurrection are not legends that developed decades or centuries later. They're very, very early and come from multiple independent sources. So I think that's why we can even use Ehrman's material to show that these miracle claims pass the historian's criteria.